whatever Mr. Trump says, it changes so often, and it is so much the product of the immediate moment and what reporter in what situation is asking him what difficult question. And his mind is probably on the Jeffrey Epstein problem that haunts him here at home and all the other issues. I wouldn't take much of a cue from this man.
So what Trump is saying here is basically don't take this too seriously. It's classic politician speak. Frame volatility as an excuse for inaction, when in reality it's an admission of having no coherent long-term economic plan in place at all.
His function, and in that he's like most American politicians these days, his function is overwhelmingly to distract from the bad news. And they do that in two ways. The Democrats, by pretending it isn't there, and the Republicans, by pretending they have the economic power of the United States that it had in the 1960s and 70s, and that it hasn't lost all of that, and therefore is in a position, even if it admits that there's a problem, to quickly fix that problem by punishing the bad other countries that caused that problem. And so, he's busy blaming and punishing and acting as though he's in a position to do much about it.
I mean, this is the comfort zone. Externalize blame. It sounds tough, but it's mostly a performance to mask limited leverage. Acting powerful when the actual toolbox is half empty is dangerous and fosters false public confidence.
So for me, and for people who think this the way I'm about to describe, we look at the problem of the dollar, and indeed of many other problems facing the United States, as falling under the heading of the very kinds of problems that you would expect in a declining empire.
To my knowledge, this framing is spot on. This isn't just a dollar story, it's about a structural power shift. Declining empires cling to old narratives long after the math and global conditions stop working in their favor.
That is, in a global empire past its peak and now in the very unhappy position of having to face slowly, relentlessly, that it doesn't have the power and it doesn't have the wealth it once had. And it can't solve these problems in the ways it once did. And so it needs, first of all, to face the basic problem, which we do not do here in the United States at all.
Here's the blunt truth no candidate dares say aloud. Admitting diminished power means rethinking the whole national strategy, something neither party is willing to do for fear of losing votes and shattering national myths.
I mean, if you remember last November, we had a presidential election in which three candidates, Biden, Harris, and Trump, never uttered one word about a declining empire or a declining U.S. capitalism, declining because its empire is gone. The very same people who could and did look at Great Britain and say the sad condition of that society and of that economy has more than a little to do with the disappearance of the British Empire.
And yet we can diagnose Britain's decline with ease. The irony is sharp. Americans apply the declining empire label abroad but treat it as heresy at home, as if we've discovered a magic exemption from history's rules.
They can say that. They can show that. But they cannot allow even the question to be applied to the United States, as if in some bizarre way, never specified, all other empires that are gone mean nothing because the American empire endures in some magical way. So the dollar, you mentioned Bretton Woods, right? The dollar becomes the world currency after the British pound and any other aspiring currency had been destroyed by World War II and couldn't possibly play that role.
I mean, that post-WWII dominance was inevitable given the context. The U.S. had unmatched industrial might, gold reserves, and military reach, conditions no one else could replicate. But even unique advantages have an expiration date.
John Maynard Keynes had hoped to preserve that role for the British pound. But the American counterpart, Harry Dexter White, made it very clear to Mr. Keynes that that was not going to happen. And it didn't. And Mr. Keynes accepted it because he basically had no choice. The dollar became the world currency. The United States was producing half the traded goods in the world economy. The United States had the nuclear weapons. The United States, I can fill in. You all know that history. The dominant position of the United States was wrapped up in the role of the dollar.
That stat alone explains dollar dominance. Half the world's traded goods came from here, but once Europe and Japan rebuilt, that share had to shrink. And with it, the unchallenged status of the U.S. dollar was bound to erode.
It quickly became not just the currency in which world trade was evaluated and conducted. It became a reserve alongside of gold to support the currencies of other countries by being held in that form as a dollar in the central bank portfolios of that time, or U.S. treasuries, which is the equivalent. So in that situation, everyone who thought about it would have known that this empire cannot last. Not at all forever. No empire ever has, but not even for very long because of the bizarre situation that the other countries that would be contesting would be coming back from wartime destruction, because you can do that relatively quickly, as both Germany and Japan showed us in the years afterwards.
Here's where economic history meets basic logic. No empire survives untouched by rivals catching up. War-torn nations recover faster than complacent powers expect. Germany and Japan proved that in just a couple decades.
So it should have been understood that the dollar cannot play that role. Well, the irony, and if I had time, I would go through it with people, is that this already happened by the 1960s. De Gaulle brought the gold back, didn't want to leave it here. We all know that story, or we should. And then the United States went off the gold standard in order to basically force the rest of the world to deal with the dollar.
To my knowledge, leaving gold was a calculated gamble. It bought the dollar more time but removed the discipline of convertibility. That flexibility was useful in the short run, but it loosened the anchors for long-term stability.
And that gave the dollar a little more time, 2 or 3 more decades. But by the end of the century, the process of decline had never stopped. The American capitalists participated and accelerated the decline when they made the decision about the same time that the U.S. went off the gold standard to move production to Asia. But in any case, out of the United States. The development of the jet engine and the development of the internet made it possible to supervise production as easily in China as before you did it in California.
And here's the self-inflicted wound. We hollowed out manufacturing for cheaper labor abroad. Technology made global oversight easy, but the trade-off was sacrificing industrial resilience for short-term corporate gains.
Or as easily in Sao Paulo, Brazil, as before you did it in Chicago. And so the wages being much lower there, those economies being desperate to bring jobs to their country, the American corporations saw enormous profit and moved out hundreds of billions of dollars of investment abroad, crucial to the development of the Brazilian economy, the Indian economy, the Chinese economy.
I mean, the scale is staggering. This wasn't gradual. It was a massive capital flight that supercharged emerging economies' growth while weakening America's productive base in ways we're still paying for today.
So the United States, which, by the way, sometimes likes to take credit for the economic development of China, and it deserves some credit. To take it away from the Chinese is childish, but that's what passes for politics in our country. But there's a grain of truth. It's partly what American corporations and European corporations and Japanese corporations did. But the end result is all of that development outside of the United States would sooner or later mean that the United States dollar wasn't necessary, did not need to play this role. And then big countries like China and India and Brazil began to learn from their own economists the privileges and the benefits you get if your currency is used around the world. And they wanted some of that for themselves, which again is what I mean by a declining empire facing demands that are natural as other economies grow.
Of course they did. Any nation seeing the perks of reserve currency status would want it too. We acted like no one else would ever compete for that role, which was both naive and strategically reckless.
And one last thing. We might have not been talking about this now. It might have gone on for another 2 or 3 decades. It really might have. But there were two things that bring it to a head now and that suggest to me it's not going away. And there's nothing Mr. Trump basically can do about this. The first is that the Chinese and the Indians are catching up, found a way to achieve much faster economic growth than the United States, which meant that the Chinese catching up, which could have and should have in many ways taken longer, has been compressed into a much shorter historical period. And the Chinese are literally discovering each day what their enormous industrial situation permits them to do. And that accelerates the decline of the dollar beyond what I think it might otherwise have been. The rapid economic growth and the inability of the United States, at least so far, to copy that, being held back by the ideology of the primacy of the private sector and the quote-unquote inefficiency of the government, limiting the role of the government, and doing this even though it's contradicted by other things that Trump is doing, he is a Republican, he is part of that tradition, and that tradition precludes the United States from copying China. They make a virtue out of it. We won't go in that authoritarian direction. But again, that's childish.
Here's the ideological straitjacket. We refuse to consider using state-led growth models because of political dogma. Calling it freedom might feel virtuous, but it's economically self-limiting in a highly competitive world.
They're not going to catch up to China if they don't, and they will be falling further behind, including the dollar, unless they do. And there is no escape from that situation.
This is as blunt as it gets. Without a major strategic shift, the U.S. will keep losing ground. Decline isn't speculative, it's measurable, ongoing, and each year of delay makes the comeback steeper and costlier.
And finally, the other thing that made it go faster is this war in Ukraine, which, couldn't have been foreseen, or maybe it should have been, and I didn't, and most of the economists I know didn't. But that war has produced a rapid acceleration in the whole BRICS phenomena. And one of the ideas of BRICS has always been to not necessarily do away with the global role of the dollar. That's really not relevant. The dollar will be important as long as the United States is as big a player in the world economy as it still is. But it will diminish, and that's for sure. And the BRICS, with the consequence of what's happening, and I say that even before dealing with today's tariff increase on India by Mr. Trump, but you could see all of this coming. This only makes the decline of the dollar happen even faster.
Here's the acceleration factor in action. BRICS members are simply acting in their own interest, building parallel systems to avoid dollar dependency, especially when U.S. policy makes such diversification more attractive.
And I think you can therefore see Mr. Trump promised to protect the dollar, and the dollar has really gone down sharply, literally, from the day he was inaugurated on the 20th of January to my speaking with you right now. Is down, depending on which currency you compare it to, but it's down 8 to 12%, and that in a short half-year period is a very serious comment on the wisdom of him protecting the dollar. That's not happening. Well, I must say I am continuously underwhelmed by what Mr. Trump is doing. I see it more and more as a kind of ad hoc mixture of a little bit of economic strategy, but it is an economic strategy that is overwhelmed almost daily by some political need he sees, correctly or incorrectly.
I mean, this is policymaking in campaign mode. When political optics dictate economic moves, you lose consistency. And without consistency, business confidence erodes, leaving investment and innovation on unstable ground.
Let me give you an example. Everyone now knows that the best quality electric vehicle at the lowest prices is produced in China. China has a dozen or more companies competing, has had them doing that for quite some years now. And as a group, they have outcompeted their counterparts in Europe, the United States, Japan, anywhere. And yet here in the United States, we currently have a 100% tariff. It was 25% in Trump's first presidency. Then Mr. Biden, by the way, on the same strategy of supporting our automobile industry here and bringing a manufacturing back to the United States, raised it to 100%. And Mr. Trump has left it at 100%. even as he negotiates with China about other tariffs. All right. The result is that in Europe, you can see BYD automobiles all over the roads. In the United States, I've never seen one. Nobody buys. There is no dealership. There is no repair system. There is no infrastructure, and there is no business. Okay, let me explain why this looks good, because it says to the American people, as Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden both did, we're going to protect auto workers. An interesting idea. You're going to protect auto workers because you make it impossible for American businesses who purchase electric cars and trucks, because that's the future of the world. They have to buy inferior vehicles at a higher price than their competitors around the world.
Yes, but at what cost? Shielding one sector by raising prices for everyone else is short-term thinking. In the long run, it makes the economy less competitive globally and hands foreign firms an open market advantage.
So an American company that, for example, makes books like this book here, when it buys cars and trucks for its personnel, it can't buy the cheapest, best truck in the world. It has to buy an inferior vehicle at a higher price. Now, I'm an economist, and I know what I just said amounts to a competitive disadvantage for American employers relative to their foreign competitors, because the foreign competitors are buying BYD cars and trucks. So, yes, you are saving jobs for General Motors and Ford and Toyota here in the United States because they don't face the Chinese competition. But are you protecting American manufacturing in general? Not at all. I would argue you are destroying it. And the longer this continues, the more and more the rest of the world will make do without trading with the United States. It's not reliable as a place to export to. That's the tariff problem. And it's not reliable as a place to do business if you would need to import anything because of the tariffs. And inside the United States, you are creating a globally uncompetitive economy.
This is where decline becomes embedded. Once foreign producers consistently outcompete on price and quality, reversing the trend is near impossible. Tariffs can't fix an innovation gap. They often deepen it over time.
Now, that'll take years to play itself out, but I don't see anything contradicting that. Nothing at all. The advantage the United States had in high technology, that has now been compromised by the Chinese demonstrating they can do pretty much what we can do, and they can do it with or without cooperation from the United States. The Huawei Corporation itself has demonstrated that from the time that the United States arranged for the arrest of the CEO's daughter in Canada to the present, when the Huawei is out competing American. I mean, you're looking at it, and the results. Look at Apple. Apple, to escape the problem of being in China, moved to India, which is now turning out to be as big or maybe bigger problem for Apple than China was. But therein lies a lesson everyone is learning by looking at Apple. If Mr. Trump's goal was to move production from the rest of the world to the United States, the herky-jerky up and down, temporary delay, these are all reasons not to be productive inside the United States, because you have no idea what the conditions are into which you would do what? Spend the money, spend the time to move production from overseas into the United States under these circumstances? And I'm not even talking about a society splitting apart in which half of the country sees Mr. Trump and his program as a kind of fascism. That word is being used often enough now that it ought to worry any responsible CEO about moving your, for me, this makes as much sense as making a big relocation decision to go into Ukraine. What? No one is that stupid. And I don't think you're going to see Mr. Trump even talking about moving production here, because even the few examples he's able to point to are very, if you look at them closely, very flaky. They have big numbers, but it's over a 10-year period. Mr. Trump will be gone as president long before that, and so will all the people making these promises. They mean nothing. They are theatric to help Mr. Trump play the game because he can't do the reality.
And that's the quiet admission. The reshoring narrative is more performance than policy. Without stable, predictable rules, no serious manufacturer will invest heavily here, because political volatility destroys long-term planning.